Welcome to this recollection of one of the most disquieting cases recorded in the history of Blue Ridge Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The winter of 1852 brought with it a silence to the Blue Ridge that many said was deeper than the snow itself. It was the kind of quiet that made men uneasy, that seemed to watch and wait, especially in the shadows of Mount Mitchell, where the forests grew dense and the valleys remained untouched by all but the most determined travelers. In Pike County, Virginia, in a place that sits now in the shadows of those ancient mountains, the story of Isaiah Green and William Carter began. A tale that would never make its way into the county's official records, but would haunt the memories of generations to come. The Green plantation stood halfway between the main road and the river, a sprawling testament to the wealth that William Carter had accumulated during his 47 years in this world. The main house rose white and imposing against the backdrop of the Blue Ridge Mountains, its columns gleaming in what little sunlight broke through the perpetual mist that seemed to cling to everything in these parts. William Carter was not an easy man, nor was he particularly cruel by the standards of his time and place. His neighbors described him as meticulous, demanding, and possessing an unsettling ability to calculate the exact worth of everything around him, including the 86 men, women, and children he owned as property. But among those souls was Isaiah Green, a man whose very existence seemed to trouble the natural order that William Carter had so carefully constructed around himself. According to records from the First Baptist Church of Pike County, Isaiah Green had been purchased by the Carter family in 1841 from a struggling tobacco plantation in North Carolina. The church ledger noted his purchase price as $700, which even then was considered remarkably high for a man of 33 years with no particular skills listed in the bill of sale. What the ledger didn't record, what no official document could capture, was the particular intensity that resided behind Isaiah Green's eyes, a kind of knowing that seemed out of place on a man who, by all legal measures, was considered property rather than person. Thomas Blackwood, who served as overseer on the Carter plantation from 1845 until 1851, would later recount to his son-in-law that there was something about the way Green carried himself that made the other slaves defer to him and made even white men watch their words in his presence. On that plantation, Isaiah Green was assigned to the blacksmith's shed, a small structure set apart from the other buildings, situated near the edge of the forest where the ground began its gradual ascent toward the mountains. Here, in this liminal space between civilization and wilderness, between ownership and something resembling freedom, Isaiah Green's story took its most unexpected turn. What made Isaiah Green different from the other slaves on the Carter plantation? Indeed, what made him different from nearly every other slave in Pike County was his remarkable facility with mechanical devices. In an era when most plantation owners carefully controlled what their slaves could learn, William Carter had made the unusual decision to allow Isaiah to develop his mechanical skills, perhaps recognizing their potential value. From the sparse accounts that survived in private correspondence, we know that Isaiah had demonstrated an uncanny ability to repair broken farm equipment, often with nothing more than scrap metal and improvised tools. By 1847, he had become indispensable to the operation of the plantation, repairing plows, wagon wheels, and even the elaborate lock mechanisms on the main house's doors. A letter from William Carter to his brother James in Richmond, dated March 1848, makes reference to the slave mechanic who had devised an improved cotton gin mechanism that processes 30% more cotton per day than the standard Whitney model. The letter continues with a calculation of how much additional profit this improvement would generate over the course of a season. What the letter doesn't mention is that Isaiah Green had never been formally trained in engineering or mechanics. According to oral histories collected from descendants of other slaves from the plantation, Isaiah had learned by watching, by taking things apart in secret, and by an intuitive understanding of how mechanisms worked that seemed to border on the uncanny. Martha Jenkins, whose great-grandmother worked in the Carter house as a cook, recalled family stories about Isaiah. They said he could look at a broken clock once and know exactly which gear was out of place. They said sometimes he would close his eyes before working on something complicated, like he was seeing the solution in his mind before his hands ever touched the metal. It was in the autumn of 1851 that William Carter made a fateful discovery. Returning unexpectedly from a business trip to Charlottesville, he found Isaiah Green working late in the blacksmith shed. But he wasn't repairing farm equipment. Instead, spread across the workbench was what appeared to be a complex mechanical device unlike anything William Carter had ever seen. According to Carter's personal journal, retrieved from the family archives in 1963 by historian Raymond Thornton, what he witnessed that night was a contraption of wood, rope, and metal composed in such a manner that it appeared capable of performing the work of 3 men in the clearing of fallen trees, with a system of pulleys and counterweights that defied immediate comprehension. The journal entry continues. When questioned, Green was initially reluctant to explain the nature of his creation, but upon pressing, admitted that he had been working on it in secret for nearly 8 months. He called it a mechanical harvester and claimed it could be adapted to various tasks around the plantation. What happened next is documented in a series of increasingly agitated entries in Carter's journal. Initially intrigued by the potential value of Isaiah's invention, Carter began to spend evenings in the blacksmith shed, watching Isaiah work and taking detailed notes. An entry from November 8, 1851 reads, "Green's understanding of mechanical principles exceeds that of any engineer I have consulted in Richmond. Yet he has had no formal education. The question that plagues me is where such knowledge could have originated." By December, Carter had become convinced that Isaiah's device could be patented and manufactured, potentially generating substantial wealth. But there was, of course, a significant obstacle. Slaves could not apply for patents, and if Carter himself applied, he would have to falsely claim to be the inventor. According to local newspaper accounts that documented subsequent events, Carter approached Isaiah with a proposition. Isaiah would continue to develop the mechanical harvester under Carter's direction, with the understanding that Carter would file for the patent, and should the device prove profitable, Isaiah would be granted certain privileges, though not his freedom. Isaiah's response, as recounted years later by Elijah Durham, the son of another slave on the plantation, was simple but profound. "Mr. Carter, this machine came from my mind. It exists because I saw it first. What you're asking is for me to give away not just the work of my hands, but the workings of my thoughts." The winter of 1851–52 was unusually harsh in Pike County. Snow fell early and often, and temperatures remained below freezing for weeks at a time. The Carter plantation, like others in the area, largely went dormant, with fieldwork impossible, and most slaves confined to their quarters except for essential tasks. It was during this period of enforced isolation that Isaiah Green began working on what would later be described as his masterpiece. In the relative solitude of the blacksmith shed, with only occasional supervision from an increasingly distracted William Carter, Isaiah refined his harvester design while secretly developing something altogether different. Elizabeth Carter, William's wife, noted in her household diary that her husband had become uncommonly preoccupied during those winter months. "William spends evenings in the blacksmith shed with that slave Isaiah," she wrote on January 12, 1852. "When he returns to the house, his mind seems elsewhere, and he fills pages of his notebook with sketches and calculations that he refuses to explain." What William Carter didn't record in his journal, what perhaps he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge, was that his relationship with Isaiah had begun to shift in subtle but significant ways. Samuel Whitaker, a neighboring plantation owner who visited Carter in late January, later wrote to his cousin that he had been disturbed by the manner in which Carter spoke of, and to his slave mechanic, addressing him almost as one would a colleague rather than property, and deferring to his judgment on matters of engineering that I myself could scarcely follow. On February 2, 1852, William Carter traveled to Richmond with detailed drawings of Isaiah's harvester, intending to consult with a patent attorney about filing an application. In the isolated environment of the shed, engaged in the complex work of mechanical design, the rigid boundaries between master and slave, between owner and property, had started to blur. He returned 5 days later with news that would alter the course of events on the plantation forever. According to Carter's journal, the attorney had informed him that while he could legally patent Isaiah's invention under his own name, there were certain ethical complications that might arise should the true origins of the device ever come to light. More concerning to Carter was the attorney's assessment that the harvester design was so innovative that it would inevitably attract attention, scrutiny, and possibly competition from northern manufacturers. "Yet I cannot claim to have invented it without risking exposure as a fraud, nor can I allow Green to continue his work without oversight, as who knows what he might devise next, or to what purpose." The decision Carter made in the days following his return from Richmond would set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in what local residents would later refer to only as the incident at Green Mountain. According to plantation records on February 12th, William Carter reassigned Isaiah from the blacksmith shed to the more remote logging camp on the eastern edge of the property, where trees were being cleared for a planned expansion of the plantation's tobacco fields. "I find myself in an untenable position," Carter wrote on February 8th. "The device is clearly valuable, perhaps enormously so. The official reason given was that the logging operation required mechanical expertise to maximize efficiency. What the records don't show, but what was later pieced together from the accounts of other slaves at the logging camp, was that Isaiah arrived with several large bundles wrapped in oilcloth, presumably containing tools and perhaps components of his unfinished devices. The logging camp was situated in a narrow valley between two ridges, approximately 4 miles from the main plantation house. It consisted of a crude overseer's cabin, a larger bunkhouse for the 12 slaves assigned to the work, and a series of clearing where felled trees were processed before being transported back to the plantation. According to weather records from a nearby farm, the 3rd week of February brought another severe snowstorm to the region, effectively cutting off the logging camp from the main plantation for several days. It was during this period of isolation that Isaiah Green completed the work that would later be described in hushed tones by those who witnessed its effects. Jeremiah Wilson, who served as overseer at the logging camp, later gave a deposition to the county sheriff that forms one of the few official records of what transpired. In it, he describes returning to the camp after securing the horses during the height of the storm to find Isaiah working by lantern light in a small lean-to adjacent to the bunkhouse. He had constructed some manner of device using pulleys, wooden gears, and what appeared to be a system of counterweights, Wilson stated. When questioned about his activities, Green explained that he was developing a more efficient method for removing stumps once the trees had been felled, which seemed a reasonable enough purpose. What Wilson didn't mention in his official statement, but what he reportedly told his wife, according to her diary entries found decades later, was that the device Isaiah was building bore little resemblance to any stump removal system he had ever seen. It had too many moving parts for such a simple task, Sarah Wilson wrote, apparently quoting her husband, and there was something about the way Green stood between me and the machine, as if he didn't want me to see all of it at once. The snowstorm lasted for 3 days, during which time William Carter remained at the main house, presumably unaware of Isaiah's continued work on his mysterious device. On the morning of the 4th day, as the snow began to clear, Carter set out for the logging camp, accompanied by his 24-year-old son William Jr. and Thomas Reed, a newly hired overseer who had previously worked on plantations in Georgia. According to the account later given by Ezekiel Johnson, one of the slaves at the camp who survived the events of that day, the 3 men arrived shortly before midday. William Carter immediately requested to see Isaiah, who was at that time working with several other men to clear fallen branches from the path leading to the camp. The exact conversation that took place between Carter and Isaiah was not overheard, but Johnson reported seeing Carter becoming increasingly agitated, gesturing repeatedly toward the lean-to where Isaiah had been working during the storm. Eventually, both men, along with Carter Jr. and Reed, moved toward the structure. What happened next has been pieced together from multiple fragmentary accounts, none of them completely reliable on their own, but which together form a coherent, if disturbing, narrative. According to Johnson, he heard raised voices from the direction of the lean-to, followed by a sound like no other, a whirring and clicking that rose in pitch until it seemed to fill the whole valley. This was followed by a cry of alarm, and then silence. And Junior, along with Thomas Reed, standing motionless, staring at what she described as a construction of wood, metal and rope that filled most of the small space and appeared to be in motion despite having no visible source of power. Isaiah Green stood beside it, one hand resting on a wooden lever, his expression, as Jeremiah would later describe it to his wife, not triumphant nor angry, but carrying a profound sadness, as if he were witnessing the inevitable conclusion to a long-considered problem. What transpired in the next few moments has been subject to considerable speculation and contradiction in the various accounts that survived. Sarah Wilson's diary, based on her husband's account, describes Jeremiah running toward the lean-to after hearing the commotion, only to find William Carter Sr. What is clear is that some kind of confrontation occurred, during which Isaiah activated his machine. The most detailed description comes from a letter written by William Carter Jr. to his uncle in 1857, 5 years after the incident. In it, he describes a device that operated on principles I still cannot fully comprehend, utilizing a system of counterweights and spring mechanisms that allowed it to function with extraordinary power while requiring minimal human intervention. The letter continues. Father demanded that Green dismantle the device immediately and return to the main plantation under guard. Green refused, stating that the machine was his creation and that he had no intention of relinquishing it. When Reed moved to apprehend him, Green pulled a second lever, causing the machine to emit a high-pitched whine, before extending what appeared to be a series of articulated arms made of wood and metal. What happened next is described by Carter Jr. in terms so fantastic that they would be easy to dismiss as the product of a traumatized mind, were it not for corroborating details found in Jeremiah Wilson's account to his wife. According to both sources, Isaiah's machine demonstrated capabilities far beyond what should have been possible with the materials and technology available. The mechanical arms moved with a precision and speed that seemed almost lifelike, creating what Carter Jr. described as a barrier of constant motion that none of us dared to cross. More remarkable still was what happened when Thomas Reed, apparently enraged by Isaiah's defiance, drew a pistol and attempted to fire at either Isaiah or the machine. Accounts differ on this point. Before he could discharge the weapon, one of the mechanical arms swung toward him with such speed that witnesses could barely follow the motion, striking his wrist and sending the gun flying into the snow. In the chaos that followed, Isaiah reportedly spoke only once. According to Carter Jr.'s letter, he said simply, "This machine understands freedom better than any man here." The confrontation ended abruptly when William Carter Sr., apparently recognizing the futility of the situation, ordered Wilson, Reed, and his son to withdraw from the lean-to. They retreated to the overseer's cabin, where Carter spent several hours writing in his journal, while the others kept watch on the lean-to, from which the strange mechanical sounds continued unabated. As dusk approached, Carter made a decision that, in retrospect, seems to have been calculated to preserve his reputation more than to resolve the situation. He instructed Wilson to evacuate all remaining slaves from the logging camp and return them to the main plantation. He then sent his son to ride to the neighboring Whitaker plantation to request assistance, specifically asking for men and firearms. What Carter intended to do with this armed force remains unclear, as events overtook his plans before they could be implemented. According to Johnson's account, as he and the other slaves were being led away from the camp, he looked back to see Isaiah emerging from the lean-to, followed by what appeared to be a construction of wood and metal that moved on its own, like a wagon without horses, with arms that reached and grasped as if alive. This fantastical description might be dismissed as superstition or exaggeration, were it not for a brief reference in William Carter's own journal found among his effects, after the events that followed. The final entry, written at the logging camp on that February evening, reads only, "Green has created something that should not exist. It moves according to his commands, yet requires no team to pull it, no steam to power it. I cannot allow such an abomination to be seen." As night fell, Carter Sr., Reed, and Wilson remained at the overseer's cabin, presumably waiting for reinforcements to arrive from the Whitaker plantation. What they didn't know was that the heavy snow had made the roads nearly impassable, delaying Carter Jr. and the requested assistance. What happened during those night hours at the logging camp has been the subject of speculation for generations in Pike County. By morning, when Carter Jr. finally returned with Samuel Whitaker and 5 armed men, they found the camp transformed in ways that defied immediate explanation. The overseer's cabin had been partially collapsed, as if struck by some tremendous force. Inside, they discovered the bodies of William Carter Sr. and Thomas Reed. According to the official report filed with the county sheriff, both men appeared to have died from massive injuries consistent with being crushed beneath a fallen structure or heavy object. Jeremiah Wilson was found alive but severely injured, unable or unwilling to provide a coherent account of the night's events. He would die 3 days later at the Carter plantation, having spoken only once during that time to his wife, reportedly saying, "It wasn't the machine that killed them. It was their fear of what it represented." Most disturbing of all was the complete disappearance of Isaiah Green and his mechanical creation. The lean-to where he had been working was empty, with no sign of the device that had been described by multiple witnesses. More perplexing still was the discovery of a narrow trail leading from the lean-to into the forest toward the mountains, a trail marked by regular indentations in the snow, unlike any human or animal tracks, which Whitaker described in his subsequent statement as appearing mechanical in nature, as if made by a device moving under its own power. A search party was organized immediately, consisting of Whitaker, Carter Jr., and 12 armed men from neighboring plantations. They followed the strange tracks for nearly 7 miles into increasingly rugged terrain before losing them at the rocky base of what is now known locally as Green Mountain. Despite an expanded search that continued for nearly 2 weeks, involving dogs and experienced trackers, no trace of Isaiah Green or his machine was ever found. The official report, filed by the Pike County Sheriff on March 4, 1852, concluded that Green had likely perished in the wilderness, a victim of exposure and harsh conditions, and that the unusual tracks were probably the result of him dragging components of his dismantled device. This explanation satisfied the legal requirements of the case, but did little to address the unsettling questions that lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the events at the logging camp. How had Isaiah created a mechanical device that could move independently? How had he, a man with no formal education, developed engineering knowledge that surpassed that of trained professionals? And perhaps most disturbing of all, where had he gone? In the months following the incident, the Carter plantation fell into disarray. William Carter Jr., having inherited his father's property and responsibilities, appeared increasingly paranoid and erratic, according to accounts from neighboring landowners. He ordered the logging camp abandoned and the area around it declared off-limits to all plantation workers. More tellingly, he sold off nearly half of the plantation's slaves within 6 months of his father's death, retaining only those who had no direct knowledge of Isaiah Green or his work. Elizabeth Carter, in a letter to her sister dated July 18, 1852, expressed concern about her son's mental state, noting that he starts at unexpected sounds and refuses to enter the workshop where father kept his notes and drawings, claiming that the space feels watched in a way he cannot explain. For nearly a year, the events at the logging camp faded into uncomfortable memory for most residents of Pike County. Then in January of 1853, the first reports began to emerge from remote homesteads and isolated cabins on the western slopes of the Blue Ridge, reports of mechanical sounds in the night and glimpses of what one farmer described as a man and a machine moving as one through the forest. These accounts might have been dismissed as superstition or the product of isolation-induced paranoia were it not for their consistency and the credibility of some witnesses. Jonathan Mercer, a respected physician who had served in the state legislature, reported encountering a Negro man accompanied by what appeared to be a mechanical conveyance of unusual design, while returning from visiting a patient near the mountain in February 1853. In his written account, preserved in the Pike County Historical Society archives, Mercer described the machine as moving independently across difficult terrain, equipped with articulated appendages that seemed to assist its progress over obstacles. He further noted that the man, whom he did not recognize but who matched Isaiah's description, acknowledged my presence with a nod but did not speak, continuing his journey northward as if I presented neither threat nor interest. By the spring of 1853, such sightings had become common enough that Samuel Whitaker organized a second search party, more heavily armed than the first. According to a letter he wrote to the governor requesting militia support, a request that was denied, Whitaker believed that Isaiah had not only survived, but was actively employing his mechanical creation for purposes unknown, but potentially threatening to the established order. The search, conducted over 3 weeks in April 1853, proved as fruitless as the first. However, it did yield one significant discovery. A small cave in the northern face of Green Mountain contained evidence of recent habitation, including crude tools, food remnants, and most intriguingly, mechanical components similar to those described in Isaiah's original harvester design. More disturbing to Whitaker and his men was what they found etched into the cave wall: detailed technical drawings showing what appeared to be increasingly sophisticated mechanical devices, including one that bore a striking resemblance to a human figure. By the summer of 1853, the story of Isaiah Green and his machine had spread throughout Western Virginia, growing with each retelling until it became difficult to separate fact from folklore. In some versions, Isaiah had perished in the mountains, his spirit inhabiting the machine he had created. In others, he had successfully escaped to the north, taking his revolutionary invention with him. What is documented is that between 1853 and 1855, no fewer than 23 slaves escaped from plantations in Pike County and surrounding areas, an unprecedented number for a region where successful escapes had previously been rare. More remarkable still was that despite increased patrols and the employment of professional slave catchers, not one of these escapees was recaptured. Plantation owners attributed this unusual success rate to various factors: increased northern abolitionist activity, more sophisticated escape networks, even changes in weather patterns that made tracking more difficult. Few were willing to consider the explanation that gradually emerged from the accounts of slaves who remained, that Isaiah Green and his machine had returned, operating in the night to guide others to freedom through paths in the mountains that pursuers could not follow. According to Henson, word had spread among the slave communities of Pike County that if one could reach the northern face of Green Mountain on the night of a new moon, the machine man would appear to lead them to freedom. Henson himself claimed to have made this journey in July 1854, writing that after waiting for several hours at the appointed location, he witnessed the approach of a figure that moved unlike any man, accompanied by a device that walked on. Mechanical legs across terrain that would defeat any horse or wagon. He continues, the figure was that of Isaiah Green, though changed in ways difficult to articulate. Jacob Henson, who served as a house slave on the Whitaker plantation during this period and later escaped to Canada, provided one of the most detailed accounts of these events in a memoir published in 1878. He spoke little, but when he guided us through the mountain paths in darkness so complete I could not see my own hand before my face, it became clear that either he or his mechanical companion could perceive the way forward when no natural sight would suffice. By 1855, the situation had become intolerable for plantation owners in the region. Losses due to escaping slaves had reached financially damaging levels, and the stories of Isaiah Green and his machine had created an atmosphere of unease that affected even the most loyal house servants. A coalition of landowners, led by William Carter, Jr., and Samuel Whitaker, petitioned the governor for military intervention, describing the situation as an organized insurrection facilitated by mechanical means devised by a former slave of unusual abilities. The governor's response, preserved in the state archives, was skeptical but pragmatic. While expressing doubt about the fantastical accounts of self-operating machines, he nevertheless authorized a company of militia to investigate disturbances in the western counties and apprehend any persons engaged in enticing slaves to abscond from their lawful owners. The militia, consisting of 60 men, under the command of Captain James Harrington, arrived in Pike County in August 1855. For 6 weeks, they conducted systematic searches of the mountain region, focusing particularly on the area where sightings of Isaiah and his machine had been most frequently reported. Their efforts yielded no direct encounter with Isaiah or his creation, but they did discover something that added yet another layer to the already improbable narrative. Deep in the mountains, in a valley accessible only through a narrow pass that showed signs of recent traffic, They found what Harrington described in his official report as a workshop of sorts, containing tools and partially completed mechanical devices of advanced design, along with evidence suggesting that multiple individuals had been living and working in the location for some time. Most significant was Harrington's assessment of the technical sophistication on display. Many of the devices and technical drawings found at the site reflect engineering principles that, to my knowledge, are not currently employed in any manufacturing establishment in the United States. The precision of the mechanical components and the innovative nature of their design suggests a level of expertise that is, frankly, difficult to reconcile with the presumed creator being a self-taught former slave. The militia destroyed the workshop and confiscated what materials they could transport, but found no trace of Isaiah or any other occupants who had apparently abandoned the site shortly before their arrival. Captain Harrington concluded his report with a recommendation that seems to capture the unsettling impact of Isaiah's story on the regional consciousness. While I remain skeptical of the more fantastical elements of the accounts provided by local residents, I must acknowledge that something unusual and potentially concerning is occurring in these mountains. Whatever Mr. Green has created, and however he has managed to evade capture for so long, his activities have inspired a dangerous level of hope among the enslaved population and corresponding fear among their owners. The discovery of the workshop marked the last official acknowledgement of Isaiah Green's existence. After the militia's departure in October 1855, reports of sightings gradually diminished, and by 1856 had largely ceased. The number of slave escapes returned to previous levels, and the story began its transition from current threat to local legend. What became of Isaiah Green and his remarkable machine? The historical record offers no definitive answer, but the folklore of the Blue Ridge provides several possibilities, each reflecting something about how subsequent generations have understood this unusual narrative. In one version, popular among the descendants of plantation owners, Isaiah perished in the winter of 1856, his machine gradually deteriorating without his expertise to maintain it. This account often emphasizes the unnatural nature of his creation, suggesting that his death represented a restoration of proper order. A different narrative emerged in the oral histories collected from the descendants of slaves who remained in the region after emancipation. In these accounts, Isaiah successfully led dozens, perhaps hundreds of slaves to freedom before ultimately making his way to Canada or even Europe, where his mechanical genius was recognized and celebrated. Perhaps most intriguing is the version that persisted among the isolated communities of the Blue Ridge Mountains themselves, those whose ancestors were neither enslaved nor enslavers, but who witnessed the events as they unfolded around them. In their telling, Isaiah neither died nor left the mountains. Instead, he established a hidden community deep in the most inaccessible regions, where he continued to develop his mechanical knowledge, creating devices decades ahead of their time. According to this tradition, the strange sounds, sometimes heard in the deepest valleys on still nights, metallic clicks and whirs that seem to follow no natural pattern, are the echoes of Isaiah's machines, still operating in secret places where few humans venture. What seems certain is that Isaiah Green, a man legally classified as property, created something that defied the limitations imposed upon him, a mechanical device sophisticated enough to inspire fear in those who witnessed it and hope in those who only heard rumors of its existence. Whether that creation was truly capable of independent movement and action, as some accounts suggest, or was simply an unusually advanced piece of engineering for its time and place, its impact on the consciousness of Pike County was profound and enduring. In 1867, 15 years after the events at the logging camp and 2 years after emancipation, A journalist from Philadelphia named Edward Harrison traveled to the Blue Ridge region to collect accounts of slave experiences during the war. Among the many stories he documented was a brief but tantalizing reference to Isaiah Green. An elderly former slave named Samuel Johnson, who had worked on the Carter plantation in the 1850s, told Harrison, "The white folks thought Isaiah was making a machine to help with the work, but that wasn't what he was doing at all. He was making something that could think like a man, but couldn't be owned like one. And when it was finished, neither man nor machine would take orders again." When pressed for more details, Johnson reportedly smiled and said only, "Some things are better left in the mountains where they belong." In 1932, during construction of what would eventually become the Blue Ridge Parkway, workers excavating a section of road near Green Mountain made a discovery that briefly revived interest in the story. Buried beneath several feet of soil and rock, they uncovered what appeared to be mechanical components of unusual design, gears, levers, and what one engineer described as articulation joints, unlike any I've previously encountered in industrial machinery. The items were sent to a museum in Richmond for examination, but apparently never arrived, having been lost or misplaced during transit. The only remaining evidence of their existence is a single photograph and a brief notation in the construction supervisor's log, describing them as artifacts of indeterminate age and purpose, possibly components of mining equipment, though of unusual sophistication. Perhaps the most fitting postscript to the story of Isaiah Green came in 1968, when a graduate student researching the history of American engineering discovered a patent application filed in Boston in 1857. The application for a self-ambulating mechanical conveyance was submitted by a free black man named Isaac Green, described as formerly of Virginia. The patent office rejected the application, citing implausibility of claims and insufficient technical detail. What makes this document remarkable is not just the similarity of name and origin to our Isaiah Green, but a notation made by the examining officer at the bottom of the rejection letter. The drawings submitted with this application bear striking similarity to certain mechanical concepts currently under development by several prominent engineers, raising questions about their true origin. Recommend investigation into the applicant's background and qualifications. Whether this Isaac Green was indeed the same man as the Isaiah Green of our narrative remains unproven. What seems clear, however, is that someone with his name and background was attempting to patent mechanical concepts advanced enough to raise suspicions among trained professionals, just as Isaiah's creations had done on the Carter plantation 15 years earlier. Today, the Blue Ridge Mountains remain largely as they were in Isaiah's time, ancient, mist-shrouded, and filled with hidden valleys and unexplored caves. Green Mountain itself has been partially incorporated into a national forest, its slopes covered with trees that have grown undisturbed for more than a century. Occasionally, hikers on the more remote trails report hearing unusual sounds, mechanical clicks and whirs that seem to follow no natural pattern, or glimpsing movement at the edge of their vision that, when investigated, reveals nothing but undisturbed forest. Most dismiss these experiences as tricks of the mind, the product of isolation and the mountain's reputation. But some, particularly those familiar with the story of Isaiah Green, wonder if somewhere in the depths of the Blue Ridge, a machine unlike any other still moves through the forest, guided by the vision of a man who refused to accept the limitations imposed upon him. A man who understood that true freedom requires not just escape, but the creation of something entirely new. What seems most remarkable about Isaiah Green's story, whether one accepts its more fantastical elements or not, is what it suggests about the human capacity for innovation even under the most oppressive circumstances. in a system designed to deny him agency, education, and recognition. Isaiah nevertheless developed knowledge and skills that by all accounts exceeded those of formally trained engineers of his time. His story serves as a reminder of the incalculable human potential that was suppressed during the era of slavery. The inventions never created, the innovations never implemented, the knowledge never shared, because those who possessed the capacity were denied the opportunity. In 1852, on a plantation in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a man legally classified as property created something that, however briefly, inverted the power relationship that defined his existence. Whether through mechanical genius, determination, or some combination of factors not captured in the surviving accounts, Isaiah Green built a machine that allowed him to say no to those who claimed ownership of his body and mind, a machine that could not be owned or controlled by anyone but its creator. In the end, perhaps that was its true purpose all along. In the years following the search for Isaiah Green and his mysterious machine, the Blue Ridge Mountains seemed to hold their secrets closer than ever. The forests grew thicker, the valleys deeper, and the local population spoke of certain areas in hushed tones, places where the usual sounds of nature would suddenly cease, replaced by a mechanical rhythm that had no place in the wilderness. Throughout the 1850s, as tensions between North and South grew increasingly heated, the legend of Isaiah Green took on new dimensions. For enslaved people throughout Virginia and neighboring states, his story became a whispered promise of possibility, not just of escape, but of a world where their ingenuity and humanity might be recognized. For plantation owners, it represented a horrifying inversion of the natural order they had constructed to justify their wealth and power. William Carter Jr. never fully recovered from the events he witnessed at the logging camp. According to church records from 1857, he became increasingly reclusive, eventually selling the plantation at a significant loss and relocating to Richmond, where he lived in a small apartment until his death in 1862. His personal papers, discovered during renovations to the building in 1912, included dozens of detailed sketches attempting to recreate what he had seen of Isaiah's machine, accompanied by increasingly frustrated notations about his inability to understand the principles behind its operation. Samuel Whitaker, who had led the searches for Isaiah, maintained an obsessive interest in the case long after others had relegated it to local folklore. County records indicate that he continued to finance expeditions into the more remote regions of the Blue Ridge until 1859, when financial difficulties forced him to abandon the pursuit. In his final letter on the subject, addressed to the governor but never sent, he wrote, "I remain convinced that Green's device represented a level of mechanical sophistication beyond our current understanding. The implications of such technology in the hands of one who has every reason to resent white authority are too significant to ignore. Yet I find myself increasingly alone in this concern." The Civil War that erupted in 1861 shifted attention away from the mystery of Isaiah Green. The Blue Ridge region, with its strategic mountain passes and remote valleys, became contested territory, with small skirmishes and guerrilla actions replacing the organized searches of previous years. Yet even during this period of broader conflict, accounts persisted of unusual encounters in the mountains. A Confederate patrol dispatched in July 1863 to investigate reports of Union sympathizers operating in the area returned with a strange tale. According to the lieutenant's report, preserved in military archives, they had pursued what they believed to be a group of escaped slaves through a particularly dense section of forest, only to find their way blocked by a barricade of logs arranged in such a precise manner that it appeared to have been positioned by engineering rather than human hands. More disturbing was his description of mechanical sounds emanating from beyond the obstruction, and glimpses of what appeared to be articulated metal appendages moving among the trees. The patrol retreated and returned with reinforcements the following day, only to find the barricade gone and no trace of those they had been pursuing. Union forces reported similar experiences as they moved through the region in 1864. A captain with the 12th Ohio Infantry documented an encounter with a Negro man of unusual mechanical aptitude, who guided his company through mountain terrain that would have otherwise been impassable. The officer noted that their guide appeared to communicate with unseen others through a device of metal and wood that emitted clicks and whirs in patterns that suggested deliberate signals rather than random noise. When the company reached their destination, the guide disappeared into the forest, declining an offer of payment or protection. As the war drew to its conclusion in 1865, bringing with it emancipation and the formal end of slavery, one might have expected the story of Isaiah Green to lose its potency. Yet in many ways, the post-war period saw the legend grow rather than diminish, particularly among newly freed black communities throughout the region. Oral histories collected from these communities in the early 20th century by folklorist Margaret Daniels reveal a consistent narrative that Isaiah Green had established a hidden settlement deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place where former slaves could find not just safety but dignity and purpose. According to these accounts, Isaiah had continued to refine his mechanical knowledge, creating devices that allowed the settlement to remain self-sufficient and secure from outside interference. Daniel's notes include dozens of variations on this theme, from practical accounts of mechanical innovations that made mountain farming possible to more fantastic tales of machines that could think like men and work like 20. What united these stories was the central figure of Isaiah, no longer just an escaped slave with unusual talents, but a visionary who had created an alternative to the oppressive systems of the outside world. Whether such a settlement ever actually existed remains unproven. No conclusive physical evidence has been discovered, despite periodic searches throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet the persistence of the belief and the consistency of details across accounts from people who had no direct contact with one another suggests, at minimum, a powerful shared vision of what Isaiah Green represented. James Wilson, the son of overseer Jeremiah Wilson, who had witnessed the original confrontation between Isaiah and William Carter, published a small pamphlet titled The Mechanical Marvel of the Blue Ridge. In it, he recounted not only his father's experiences, but also his own subsequent investigation into what he called the most significant, unreported technological development of our time. According to Wilson's account, he had spent years collecting information from various sources. Former slaves who claimed to have been helped by Isaiah, mountaineers who reported strange sightings in remote valleys, even engineers who had examined mechanical components found in the region. In 1879, 17 years after the incident at the logging camp, a peculiar series of events brought renewed attention to the case. The pamphlet included detailed technical drawings of what Wilson believed Isaiah's machine had looked like, based on these accumulated descriptions. What made Wilson's publication particularly notable was his assertion that Isaiah had not merely created a single mechanical device, but had developed an entirely new approach to engineering, one that utilized principles of self-regulating systems and mechanical adaptation that would not be formally recognized by mainstream science for decades. The true significance of Green's work, Wilson wrote, lies not in the specific machine he constructed, but in the conceptual framework that allowed him to envision and create it. Without formal education or access to existing technical literature, he independently developed mechanical principles that our most esteemed engineers are only now beginning to understand. The pamphlet caused a brief stir in certain scientific circles, with several prominent engineers expressing interest in examining any surviving examples of Isaiah's work. However, Wilson could provide no physical evidence beyond the components already documented, most of which had been lost or destroyed over the intervening years. Without tangible proof, professional interest quickly waned, and Wilson's claims were generally dismissed as exaggerations or outright fabrications. Yet the pamphlet found a different audience among black communities throughout the South, particularly among those who had settled in the Appalachian region after emancipation. For these readers, Wilson's technical explanations were less important than the central narrative that an enslaved man had developed knowledge that surpassed that of his supposed betters, creating something that could not be controlled or owned by those who claimed to own him. By the turn of the century, as the last individuals with first-hand knowledge of the events passed away, the story of Isaiah Green had completed its transformation from recent history to regional legend. It became one of many tales told about the Blue Ridge, a story that, whether literally true or not, captured something essential about the place and its people. What makes Isaiah's story different from most mountain folklore, however, is the tangible legacy it appears to have left on the region's technological development. Throughout the late 19th century, the Blue Ridge area produced a disproportionate number of mechanical innovations, particularly in small-scale manufacturing and agricultural equipment. Many of these innovations came from individuals with limited formal education but remarkable practical ingenuity, people who, when asked about their methods, often referenced techniques and approaches they had learned from the mountain. In 1905, an engineering professor from the University of Virginia named Robert Thornton became interested in this phenomenon. After documenting dozens of mechanical innovations that had originated in previously isolated Blue Ridge communities, he published a paper suggesting a common intellectual lineage, a shared approach to mechanical problems that differed significantly from mainstream engineering practices of the time. There appears to exist in these communities, he wrote, a body of technical knowledge passed down through informal channels, originating with an individual who is spoken of with near reverent respect, but whose historical identity remains obscure. This technical legacy represents perhaps the most concrete evidence that Isaiah Green was not merely a character of folklore, but a genuine innovator, whose work, though largely undocumented in formal records, had a lasting impact on those who came after him. While Thornton did not explicitly connect this tradition to Isaiah Green, he did note that many of the innovators he interviewed referenced a legendary figure who had established the principles they followed. As the 20th century progressed and the Blue Ridge region became increasingly connected to the broader world through improved transportation and communication, opportunities to document the more remote communities diminished. Areas that had been nearly inaccessible in Isaiah's time were gradually incorporated into national parks or opened to tourism, bringing with them increased scrutiny and decreased isolation. Yet even as late as 1937, accounts persisted of unusual mechanical devices found in abandoned cabins deep in the mountains, devices that utilized principles of self-regulation and adaptive mechanics that seemed out of place in such remote locations. In most cases, these discoveries were inadequately documented, with the items themselves often disappearing into private collections or being dismantled by souvenir hunters before they could be properly studied. One notable exception occurred in 1942, when a team from the Smithsonian Institution, conducting a survey of Appalachian folk technology, discovered what appeared to be a mechanical loom in a remote cabin near the Virginia-North Carolina border. According to their report, the device incorporated several innovative mechanisms that allowed it to adjust tension and spacing automatically based on the characteristics of the material being woven, a level of sophistication that would not become standard in commercial looms until decades later. Of particular interest was an inscription found on one of the wooden components, the initials IG, followed by what appeared to be the date 1867. While the researchers noted the potential connection to Isaiah Green, they stopped short of making a definitive attribution, citing the lack of documented provenance. The loom was transported to Washington for further study, but was apparently damaged during the journey, with key components being declared too deteriorated for meaningful analysis. It was subsequently placed in storage, where it remained uncatalogued and essentially forgotten until a routine inventory in 1978 brought it briefly to light again. By the mid-20th century, as the last individuals who might have had direct connection to Isaiah's story through family oral history aged and passed away, it seemed that the full truth of what he had created and what had become of him would never be definitively known. The Blue Ridge Mountains, despite increasing development and tourism, maintained their capacity to keep secrets, with certain valleys and caves remaining as inaccessible as they had been in the 1850s. Then in 1967, a discovery was made that reignited interest in the case, at least among those familiar with the legend. A team of spelunkers exploring a previously unmapped cave system near Green Mountain came across what appeared to be the remains of a workshop, preserved by the constant temperature and humidity of the deep cave environment. Among the items found were tools of unusual design, mechanical components that showed remarkable precision given their apparent age, and most significantly, a leather-bound journal containing technical drawings and notations. The journal, which was eventually donated to the University of Virginia's Special Collections, contained no definitive identification of its author. However, the technical drawings matched descriptions of Isaiah's work from multiple historical sources, and several pages contained the same IG initials found on the mechanical loom discovered decades earlier. Most remarkable were the concepts illustrated in the journal's later pages, mechanical systems that incorporated principles of feedback and self-regulation that would not become standard engineering practice until well into the 20th century. According to Dr. Elizabeth Harris, an engineering historian who examined the journal in 1981, if these drawings date from the period suggested by contextual evidence, they represent a level of conceptual sophistication that would place their creator decades ahead of the mainstream engineering knowledge of his time. The journal also contained brief narrative passages that, while never explicitly identifying the author, provided tantalizing glimpses into his experiences and motivations. One particularly notable entry, dated simply Winter 1866, reads, "The machine continues to improve itself according to the principles I established. Each iteration learns from the limitations of the previous." I sometimes wonder if Carter could see it now. Would he understand that what he witnessed was merely the beginning, that the true purpose was never about escape alone, but about creating something that could evolve beyond its creator's initial conception? Another passage, apparently from a later date, though the specific year is illegible, states, "Our community grows slowly but steadily. Those who find their way to us bring their own knowledge, their own skills. The machines we build together incorporate all these perspectives, becoming more than any single mind could have designed. This, I believe, is the future that was denied to us in the outside world, one where each person's contribution is valued not based on their origin, but on the merit of their ideas." These fragments suggest that Isaiah not only survived well beyond his escape from the Carter plantation, but established some form of community that continued his work. Whether this community was as extensive as suggested by folklore, or simply a small group of like-minded individuals who shared his technical interests, remains unclear. The cave workshop itself provided few additional clues. Carbon dating of organic materials found at the site suggested occupation from the mid-1860s through at least the 1880s, but there was no indication of what had ultimately happened to its inhabitants. They appeared to have departed in an orderly fashion, taking most of their possessions and more complex creations with them, leaving behind only items that were broken, obsolete, or too large to transport easily. In the decades since this discovery, periodic attempts have been made to locate any potential descendant community. These efforts have been hampered by the fact that no census records exist for Isaiah Green or any identifiable associates, and oral traditions among Black Appalachian communities, while preserving the general outlines of the story, rarely include specific geographical information that might lead to concrete evidence. Yet there are occasional hints that something of Isaiah's legacy may have survived into the modern era. Throughout the Blue Ridge region, particularly in its more isolated communities, one still encounters mechanical innovations that seem to exist outside mainstream technological development. Simple but elegant solutions to local problems that utilize principles not commonly found in commercial equipment. When asked about the origins of these devices, their creators often reference techniques passed down through generations, learned from parents or grandparents who themselves attributed their knowledge to earlier traditions. While few explicitly connect these traditions to Isaiah Green by name, the pattern of transmission suggests a continuity of technical knowledge that extends back to the pre-Civil War era. In 2003, a project led by researchers from Howard University began documenting these indigenous technical traditions, creating a database of mechanical innovations unique to the Blue Ridge region. Their preliminary findings noted several consistent characteristics across different communities: a preference for self-adjusting mechanisms over fixed settings, the incorporation of local materials used in unconventional ways, and most intriguingly, a conceptual approach that emphasized the machine's ability to learn from its environment, to modify its operation based on changing conditions without human intervention. James Thompson, the project's lead researcher, observed that these characteristics closely matched those described in historical accounts of Isaiah Green's work. While we cannot prove direct lineage, he wrote in the project's initial publication, the conceptual continuity is striking. These communities preserve an approach to mechanical design that developed in parallel to, and in some ways anticipated, much later developments in adaptive systems and even rudimentary artificial intelligence. Perhaps the most fitting postscript to Isaiah Green's story came in 2011, when a researcher exploring the digital archives of the U.S. Patent Office discovered a series of patents filed between 1910 and 1920 by a man named Isaac Green, Jr., identified as residing in a small community in western Pennsylvania. The patents, 15 in total, covered a range of mechanical innovations, from agricultural equipment to manufacturing processes. What made them remarkable was not just their technical sophistication, but the explicit connection made in several of the applications to principles developed by my grandfather, Isaac Green Sr., formerly of Virginia. While no direct evidence connects this Isaac Green Jr. to our Isaiah Green, the coincidence of name, time frame, and regional connection is suggestive. More compelling still is the nature of the innovations described in the patents, all focused on creating machines that could adapt to changing conditions with minimal human intervention, incorporating principles of feedback and self-regulation that were advanced for their time. If this connection is valid, It suggests that Isaiah not only survived his escape into the Blue Ridge, but established a family line that carried his technical knowledge forward into the 20th century. A legacy that eventually found its way back into the formal systems of documentation and recognition from which he himself had been excluded. Today, the Blue Ridge Mountains have been largely mapped, their valleys and caves explored by generations of hikers, researchers, and tourists. The region that once seemed remote enough to hide a man and his revolutionary machine now hosts national parks, scenic highways, and vacation homes. Yet there remain areas where the forests grow particularly dense, where cell phone signals fade inexplicably, where hikers occasionally report unusual sounds that seem mechanical rather than natural in origin. In these remote places, one might still imagine Isaiah Green continuing his work, refining machines that think like humans but cannot be owned like them, creating technology that serves freedom rather than control. Whether he actually survived to establish the hidden community of legend, whether his descendants continue his work in some form today, or whether he perished soon after his escape, his story reminds us of the human capacity for innovation even under the most oppressive circumstances. Perhaps the true legacy of Isaiah Green lies not in any specific machine he created, but in the idea he represented, that knowledge cannot be fully contained by systems of oppression, that the human mind will seek freedom through whatever means available, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to create something that should not exist according to the limitations others have placed upon you. In the words attributed to Isaiah himself in the final pages of the Cave Journal, they believed they owned not just my body, but my mind, my creativity, my very ability to envision a different world. In creating this machine, I proved them wrong. And in that moment of creation, I became truly free, not just from them, but from the boundaries they had convinced me existed. That is the real machine I built. Not one of wood and metal, but one of possibility. As the Blue Ridge fades into evening shadows and the mechanical sounds of modern life gradually give way to the ancient rhythms of the forest, one might still hear, if listening carefully, the faint clicks and whirs of something moving through the underbrush, something that walks the boundary between human ingenuity and inexplicable wonder, between documented history and enduring legend. Something that reminds us that the most powerful machines ever created are not those that extend our physical capabilities, but those that expand our conception of what is possible, even for those from whom everything else has been taken.